Next month, I'm preaching my last sermon at the Corner Church in Northern Virginia. 22 years, same church, same community. And when I stand up to preach that final Sunday, I'm not going to talk about what we've built. I'm not going to walk through tons of memories or milestones. I'm going to talk about someone who isn't in the room, someone who has never been in the room. I'm talking about the one person who might be driving past the building every week, who has real questions about God, about the Bible, about Jesus, about whether any of this is worth a second look. The person who had picked up a Bible at some point, found it confusing, and then put it back down. The person who wasn't sure they were welcome to ask questions or wonder out loud. That's who I can't stop thinking about. And that's why this podcast exists. So before we go anywhere else, before we start digging into ancient languages, archaeological discoveries, and the cultural details that suddenly make the Bible make sense, I want to tell you about a moment in Luke's biography of Jesus that completely reframed how I think about why any of this matters. Because there's something in this passage that most people completely miss. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Luke chapter 15 opens with a scene that's easy to gloss over if you're not paying attention. Jesus is teaching, and Luke tells us who's listening: tax collectors and sinners. People that first century Jewish society had largely written off, but they were crowding around Jesus. And standing at the edges, watching and muttering, were the Pharisees and the religious teachers of the day. Now here's the thing you need to know to understand why what happens next is so explosive. In first century Israel, who you ate with was a statement. It wasn't just social preference. It was a declaration about who you considered acceptable, clean, worthy of your company. The Pharisees had a detailed system for this. Holiness, in their understanding, meant separation. You maintained your purity by keeping careful distance from people whose lives didn't measure up to yours. And here's Jesus, this teacher who is generating enormous crowds and doing things nobody can quite explain. And he's not keeping his distance. He's eating with them, welcoming them. The Greek word the Pharisees use in verse 2 is prosdeketai. It means to welcome, to receive, to accept. They say it like an accusation. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. They mean it as a criticism. Jesus hears it and responds with a story. He said, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? This is one of the most recognizable images in all of the Gospels. Even people who have never opened a Bible have some version of this story floating around in the back of their mind. And most of us hear it and think we understand it. It's about not giving up. It's about caring for the individual. It's a nice story about persistence. But here's where the historical context changes everything. Because Jesus is not telling a generic story about a generic shepherd. He is telling this specific story to this specific crowd in this specific cultural moment. The people standing in front of him would have heard things in this parable that we almost entirely miss. Let's slow down and look at what they actually knew. First, shepherds were not romantic figures. We tend to picture shepherds the way they show up in Christmas pageants: gentle, peaceful, kind. The reality in first century Judea was almost the opposite. Shepherds occupied one of the lowest rungs in Jewish society. They were considered ritually unclean because of constant contact with animals. They were frequently poor, often propertyless, and sometimes hired out by families who could barely afford them. Critically, they were widely regarded as untrustworthy. There's rabbinic literature from this period that lumps shepherds together with tax collectors as people whose testimony could not be accepted in court. There's even evidence that some Jewish communities debated whether it was allowed to buy wool or milk from a shepherd on the assumption that the animals might be stolen. So when Jesus opens with, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep," the Pharisees in the crowd, these religious teachers, they're not nodding along warmly. This story is about a shepherd, a ritually suspect, socially marginalized, professionally disreputable shepherd. Second, 100 sheep was a real flock, and leaving 99 of them was not a small thing. In the first century, shepherds often worked in cooperative groups. There were systems for watching each other's flocks, for covering when someone had to go, for managing the real danger of predators and thieves. A flock of 100 was a working flock. This is the livelihood of a family, probably more than one. When Jesus says the shepherd leaves the 99 to go after the one, his listeners would have understood the stakes. This is not a casual decision. This is the shepherd putting everything else at risk to find the one that is gone. The word that Luke uses in this biography of Jesus for lost here is from the verb apollymi, which means to destroy, to be completely lost. This isn't a sheep that wandered a few yards away. In the ancient world, a lost sheep in the open hill country of Judea was in real danger. Sheep don't survive well alone. They panic. They freeze. They become easy targets. A sheep that's been separated from the flock is, without intervention, a sheep that will die. Third, and this is the one that changes everything, the sheep cannot find its way back. In modern tellings of the story, we sometimes imagine the sheep just needs a little help, a nudge in the right direction. But anyone who knows anything about sheep knows they don't navigate. They don't retrace their steps. A lost sheep does not figure out that it's lost and start problem solving. The only way this sheep survives is if the shepherd comes looking. That's the world Jesus is painting. A shepherd, socially marginalized, not the kind of person the religious establishment would hold up as a model. A shepherd goes out to find something that cannot find its way back on its own. And he doesn't stop looking until he finds it. Now watch what Jesus does with this. He asks the crowd, doesn't he leave the 99 and go after the lost one? This is a rhetorical question. And in first century Jewish teaching, rhetorical questions were a specific device. They were used to lead the audience to a conclusion that they could not argue with. The expected answer here is, well, yeah, obviously. Of course the shepherd goes. But Jesus is doing something subtle and subversive. The Pharisees are standing there watching him welcome those people, the tax collectors, the sinners, the ones who in the Pharisees' minds have made themselves lost through their own choices. They deserve it. And Jesus tells a story where the whole point is the lost don't stay lost because the one who cares about them refuses to stop looking. And then he closes the parable with this. I tell you that in the same way, there'll be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. The word for rejoicing here in Greek, chara, appears throughout Luke's biography of Jesus, surrounding moments of profound reversal. It's not quiet satisfaction. It's the kind of joy that makes you want to call your neighbors. The point is not that the 99 don't matter. The point is that the one who is lost, the one who cannot find their way back, the one who seems least likely to be retrieved, is the one who becomes the reason for this kind of joy. That's the heart Jesus is describing. Not a God who waits at a distance for people to get their act together and find their own way home. A God who goes out looking. Here's why I couldn't stop thinking about this passage in my final weeks of ministry at the Corner Church. I've spent nearly 30 years helping people understand the Bible. And one of the things I kept running into over and over was this. The people who most wanted to understand it were often the ones who felt most locked out of it. Not because they weren't smart enough, not because they didn't care, but because the Bible was written in a world so far from our own. Different languages, different culture, different geography, different assumptions. Reading it without understanding the context can feel like arriving in a conversation that started 2,000 years before you got there. And so, people pick it up. They find it confusing, and they put it back down. And somewhere in the back of their minds, a question forms. And they begin to think, maybe this just isn't for me. That's what I want to address with this podcast. Every single episode. Because here's what I've seen over and over. When you give someone the context, when you show them what the original audience already knew, what those words meant to the people who first heard them, something shifts. The confusion lifts. The text comes alive, and suddenly the distance doesn't feel quite so impossible. The one who thought the Bible wasn't for them discovers that it was, in some ways, written with people exactly like them in mind. That's the work this podcast is trying to do. Not just historical curiosity, not academic exercise. Context as a way of closing the distance between you and a text that has something to say to you, if you can understand what it's actually saying. If you found this episode because you're curious about the Bible, but you're not sure you believe it, that's exactly why this podcast exists. You don't need a background in religion. You don't need to have grown up in a church. You don't need to have any particular set of beliefs before you press play. What you need is a willingness to ask honest questions. And maybe a small amount of curiosity about what happens when you understand something in its proper context. The shepherd in this story didn't wait for the sheep to find its way back. He went out looking. And the way I read it, the point of that story isn't just historical. It's directional. It points us toward a God who does not write off the one who is lost, who does not consider the questions too hard, the distance too great, the gap too wide. And if that's true, if the heart of God is oriented toward the one who is looking, the one who's confused, the one who isn't sure, then a podcast that exists to make the Bible more accessible to exactly that person seems like it's pointed in the right direction. I hope you'll keep listening. Every episode of Now It Makes Sense exists to close the gap between you and a text that, once you understand it in its proper context, has a lot more to say than you might expect. God can handle your questions. This is the place for them.